Have you ever heard someone claim that the Bible's been through so many changes and so many revisions that we really can't know what the original message was?
Yeah, they're called every biblical scholar ever.
Let's use some coffee beans to illustrate a major problem with that argument.
Instead of, refuting it with logic and reason.
For Tacitus, he wrote his famous work called the Annals around the year AD 100. How many copies do we have? Just 2. So let's put 2 beans in this cup to represent those manuscripts. For Plato's Dialogues, there's a 1,200-year gap, and we have just 7 copies. For the Histories by Herodotus, there's a 1,300-year gap with just 9 copies. And we have 10 copies of Caesar's Gallic Wars after a 900-year gap. Now, very few people question whether we have the original message of these writings, yet they constantly attack the Bible on this point.
The difference is, no one is saying that those other works are inerrant truth. No one is fighting wars over what those other works say. No one is trying to pass laws based on what's in those books. That just might make a little teeny tiny bit of a difference, you think? Besides, scholars debate all the time how much these manuscripts might differ from the original and what changes might have been made in the interim. They even do it with ancient texts of religion and philosophy, like the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching. But you don't want anyone doing that with the Bible at all!
So what about the New Testament? Well, it was written in the 1st century AD, and the earliest manuscript evidence we have for it comes within 50 years of that time.
Lie! 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 We have no New Testament manuscripts prior to the 2nd century, with the exception of a couple of minuscule fragments of no significant length. And we only have 2 papyrus manuscripts dating to before the 3rd century, and even then, they're heavily fragmented. No complete texts exist prior to the year 350. And by the way, they're all in Greek, but Jesus would have spoke Aramaic, not Greek, so you don't even have them in the original language. Not only that, but a lot of these early manuscripts show mistakes along with corrections made by scribes at the time or shortly after. Funny how people would have to do that with the inerrant Word of God.
Now, how many copies do we have? Well, there are nearly 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts, and they average about 450 pages each.
That's a pretty good representation of the amount of crap you've been flinging. What other significance it has, I don't know, because none of those go back any closer to the original. It doesn't matter how many copies you have. If they're copies of a later text, they are no replacement for an earlier text.
But you know what? That's just the Greek manuscripts. When we count the other languages like Latin, Coptic, and Armenian, there's another 20,000 manuscripts.
But none of those date anywhere close to the original, and they're just translations of the earlier Greek. I have no idea what kind of point this idiot is trying to make.
As I mentioned earlier, critics and skeptics rarely question whether we have the original message of these writings.
Because we know that we don't!
And yet they frequently attack the Bible on this point.
Yes, because people like you keep claiming that you do have the original Bible when you don't! You also claim that it's absolutely 100% the inerrant Word of God. Again, that's quite a big difference.
Some critics will say that there are a lot of differences between those New Testament manuscripts, or these differences what we call variants. And they say there's tens of thousands of these variants. But the reason there's so many of these variants is because there are so many manuscripts.
Well, duh! But the point is, why are there any differences if each and every copy is the inerrant Word of God?
So what the critic is trying to do is take a great strength for the reliability of the text and turn it into a weakness.
So the fact that they're not the same means they're more accurate? Huh?
But here's the great thing about this. Because we have so many manuscripts, we can compare and contrast those. We know where those differences are, we know what they are, and we know that they're really insignificant and rarely do they have any bearing on the meaning of the text.
Another incredible lie. Most translations of the New Testament come from the Textus Receptus, or received text, collated by Desiderius Erasmus in the 16th century. And then you have the critical text, where you look at the earliest texts available, and you find very significant differences here. In fact, you have entire verses missing from the critical text, like Matthew 17:21, which says this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting, or 18:11, for the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. There are numerous other omitted verses like Matthew 23:14 and Mark 11:26. I'm just going to get the big differences, not even scratching the surface, the major ones like Mark 6:11, when Jesus says to spread his message to other cities, quote, "And whoever will not receive you nor hear you, when you depart from there, shake off the dust under your feet as a testimony against them. Assuredly, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city." That second sentence about the day of judgment isn't in the critical text at all. It just says to leave them alone. It does not say that they'll be condemned. John 7:53 to 8:11 isn't anywhere in the critical text. This is the part where Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives and they bring an adulterer to be stoned, and Jesus says, "Let him without sin cast the first stone," and to the adulterer, "Go forth and sin no more." Very popular story in John, considered very important by Christians, not there. How about everything after verse 8 of Mark 16? This includes Mary Magdalene seeing the Jesus zombie, as well as him appearing to 2 disciples, the Great Commission to preach the gospel throughout the world, and Jesus ascending to the right hand of God. None of that is in the critical text. And you're telling me these differences are minor? No one who has looked at these texts think they're the same except for a few minor differences. And if these differences are there, how confident can we be with the rest? How do we have any way of knowing that the other parts aren't later additions or embellishments? And what about the Q Gospel? Ever heard of that? Of course you have, and morons like you deny it. But there's a huge problem here. See, we know that the authors of Matthew and Luke, who were not Matthew and Luke, by the way, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were names arbitrarily applied to them centuries later. Anyway, Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source for the narrative, but there are also large parts of those texts representing the words of Jesus that they didn't get from Mark. Yet we know they had to have gotten them from an earlier text. How? Because they're verbatim. Every single character is identical. And before you say, well, they were just passing along the words of Jesus, again, those words would have been in Aramaic, or perhaps Hebrew. Even if they'd had the original Aramaic, it's the height of stupidity to think that 2 different people would translate the same Aramaic text into Greek without any differences at all. No, they got this Greek text from somewhere else. This is called the 2-source hypothesis. Scholars call this hypothetical document the Q Gospel, short for Quelle, German for source. Some document like this has to exist, but where is it? Why did the early church not keep any copies of it? That's pretty irresponsible of them. You see, we have no assurance that everything from Q was copied over, which leaves the incredibly important question of what was in Q that was lost. This theory got a shot in the arm in 1945 with the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas among the Nag Hammadi texts, which date back to the 2nd century and represent a lot of material that isn't in the New Testament. Yes, we're seeing that the Bible we have today is very much a heavily edited volume. What's interesting about Thomas is that there's no narrative of any kind about Jesus' life. It's a book of sayings, preachings, and dialogues attributed to Jesus. It's very similar in form to what the Q Gospel must have been like, and might well have been a later version of it. And all of this is just if I limit myself to the Gospels. The rest of the New Testament isn't any better. Think we have any original letters of Paul? In fact, we know that some of them weren't actually written by Paul at all.
Therefore, having thousands of manuscripts, even when there are some textual variants that we can work through, is a more reliable way to know that the Bible we have on our shelves and hopefully regularly in your hands for about 82 hours of daily quiet time.
Did he just say there were 82 hours in a day?
Is more reliable than any other book in history. Period.
Really? Even if we don't look at all these other texts and just look at the received text, we get things like 2 completely different and contradictory stories of the death of Judas. First of all, in John, Jesus voluntarily steps forward. Judas doesn't point him out at all, certainly doesn't kiss him the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke say. After the crucifixion, in Matthew, Judas throws down the silver and hangs himself, and the chief priests use the money to buy the potter's field. In Acts, Judas buys a field himself, and then falls on it and bursts open and his guts spew out for no given reason whatsoever. You also have two completely different lineages giving the all-important link from Jesus up to David. Matthew gives Joseph's father as Jacob, and Luke gives Joseph's father as Hel. Matthew says Jesus is descended from David through Solomon. Luke says it's Nathan. By the way, Jewish lineage is determined through the female line, a practice dating back at least 1,000 years before Jesus. You'd think they would have known that. We're also talking about major things too, like the all-important revelation direct from heaven to Simon Peter in Matthew 16:17, when, according to John 1:41, he heard it from his brother Andrew. Hey, how about Jesus' birth? We all know how important that is. In Luke, the Quirinian census means that Mary and Joseph have to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem, the city of Joseph's ancestor David, even though the actual Quirinian census had no such requirement. But hey, you gotta get them to Bethlehem somehow. There's a prophecy to fulfill after all. Quirinius came to power in 6 AD, and the census was the same year. So they hoof it off to Bethlehem, give birth to Jesus, do some other stuff, then go back home to Nazareth, which you also need to fulfill the prophecy that he'll be a Nazarene. Even though originally Nazarene just meant someone who'd taken the Exodus oath, the city of Nazareth hadn't existed at the time of the so-called prophecy, but hey, I guess technicalities count! But in Matthew, they were already in Bethlehem. They had Jesus, then they got wind that Herod was going to have them killed, so they bugger off to Egypt for a couple of years waiting for Herod to die, which he did 2 years later. They went back to Israel, but given that Herod's son Archelaus was ruling over Judea, they decided it was safer to go live in Nazareth, where they had never lived before. By the way, Herod died in 4 BC, so according to Matthew, Jesus was born in 6 BC, 11 years before the Quirinian census. Is it just me, or does the fulfillment of these prophecies read more like fanboy retcons than history? Hey, if you enjoyed this video, why not hit like and subscribe? And to make sure I can keep producing content, support this channel by becoming a patron. And check out all the other great content here, like this video selected especially for you.